All right, you've made it this far. We are about halfway through, which is good. So, a summary of the first chapters. The first one is kind of talking about the nature of the conspiracy as an actual thing. Some people don't like to connect communism with conspiracy because communism is supposed to be this big grassroots effort that leads to the dispersal of wealth. And the other chapters. In the first chapter, it describes that this is not ever, that is the means of getting people on board, but it never ends up being the case. Talk about how socialism is within the political spectrum, basically on both ends, whether you are international socialist or national socialist or Fabian socialist, that within the American system, socialism has really crept things towards the left. And because of a few specific markers, like the formation of a central bank, like monopolies that are within the American system that are not necessarily owned by Americans, but by international bankers. And that's kind of a different entity. They could be American or not, but when they are owned by these international bankers without American interests, that kind of changes the thing, the whole kind of landscape. And we'll find that more in Chapter 4, which is called Bankrolling the Bolshevik Revolution, which talks about how the bankers, we have these families. That's the Rothschild family, like with the different sons in these different cities around the world, and they're kind of controlling these central banks in those areas and end up funding both sides of these wars because it is a major money-making opportunity. Trying to think if there's anything specific that's worth reminding. Yeah, chapter 3 was about the central banks, and if you can control that, then if you can control the money, that's where the opportunity is. And we'll find some interesting things here. So this is Bankrolling the Bolshevik Revolution, which is more of a chapter kind of leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution, which in chapter 5 it's financing it. But this chapter is more about World War One, about the Germans and Americans and other things going on, as well as these international bankers who are actually benefiting by increasing the national debt. And we'll find that as soon as they kind of inject and get control of the central banks, which is one of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto 10 planks or whatever for socializing the country, that's when things, it starts to seem more inevitable. Just as in this chapter, you will find people pushing that war is inevitable. So when you hear, and that's relevant today because you see YouTube videos, you see all these commentators, and it seems that way, that people are, it seems that war is inevitable, and there are wars. But when you see that being told, it should maybe raise an eyebrow, because one of the things that America stood for a long time was this non-interventionism, and we will find just why they got pulled into the war, and that things, kind of their identity and their whatchamacallit, their identity became to go help the downtrodden and do this and this and be there for others. And you can stand wherever you stand on that, but it is important to note that ideology or that character that they took on has changed. Like, their war against the British was to have the British leave them alone, and now there would be many that would say that America is kind of doing the same sort of thing, which, I'm not giving my opinion on that sort of thing here. And I think that it's important to stand up for allies. But again, it's important to note that things have changed. So one of the things that is brought up here in chapter 4 is that of the inclusion of the progressive income tax. And we know about income tax brackets and whatnot. And sounds like a great thing, right? Sounds like something that the grassroots people can get behind. Because why shouldn't the rich pay their fair share? But when you include this progressive income tax and include loopholes for some of the super wealthy, and again, this book is written by a conservative, right? And there are left wing kind of talking points, tax the rich and things like that. But then what comes to mind is the Trump-Hillary debate, where she says that Trump needs to be taxed and da-da-da-da-da. And then he fires right back, and it kind of made him a folk hero almost, that he said, yeah, of course I don't. It's built right into the code. It's built right into the tax code that you've been involved with and your donors and your other rich friends are involved with. You're not going to change it. And so this is written in 1971, and it speaks exactly to that, and how there are some of these super rich that are able to find those loopholes and some that don't. And because some don't get those loopholes, it creates, it gets rid of the competition and more moves towards centralized power and centralized monopolies. And when I think of America, I think of competition in industry, and that being a part of why it has grown so much and why it is so special. But when you have centralized monopolies and things like that just, I can't think of anything that could stifle growth more than that. So there's this progressive income tax. Many wealthiest Americans supported it, some because of altruism and things like that, some because they knew that there was a plan for permanently avoiding this income tax. We have members of this insider group infiltrating left-wing political movements, because it just, it can become like this grassroots effort against the man and whatnot, actually without people realizing that they are being useful idiots and falling for the very enemies that are being placed or preached against. And, I read lots of books. I mean, fantasy books and fiction and sci-fi and blah, 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 blah. And often it is the case, and it's built on with history, and it's often the case that the solution to the problem comes from the person who even formed that problem. And you can think of some of the things that happened in 2020 and maybe wonder, you look at some of the people who became super rich in some of these companies and wonder what's behind that. And, it's just the case that when you see crisis, sometimes people become very wealthy, and that should put your eyebrows up, or one eyebrow up, I guess is the thing, right? So one person, who is this that said this? The historian Oswald Spengler wrote that there is no proletarian, not even communist movement that has not operated in the interest of money, in the direction indicated by money. And goes on later in this chapter for about a page about how the competition is inevitable. There is an illusion of American industry being. Actually, let me just read this. Who wrote this specific quote? Gabriel Kolko. In The Triumph of Conservatism, he says this, quote, "The significant reason for many businessmen welcoming and working to increase federal intervention into the affairs has been virtually ignored by historians and economists. The oversight was due to the illusion that American industry was centralized and monopolized to such an extent that it would rationalize the activity, regulate production and prices, in its various branches voluntarily. Quite the opposite was true. Despite the large number of mergers and the growth in the absolute size of many corporations, the dominant tendency in the American economy at the beginning of the century was towards growing competition. Competition was unacceptable to many key business and financial interests." And let me keep going on here. So isn't that interesting? The best way for insiders to eliminate the growing competition was to impose a progressive income tax on their competitors while writing in laws so as to include built-in escape hatches for themselves. And remember, this is leading up towards the Great War, where before American was non-interventionist, and then we have the Great War, and we have things happening. We have the Ezra Eagle thing happening, starting with Herbert Hoover. We have this new identity of America, and we have this idea that now there are these foreign interests, and by foreign I don't necessarily mean non-American, but foreign interests in that they are not duly elected. They are these other powers in these other rooms, who have a vested interest in maybe not even just America, but in other have dealings in financing the financial systems of other countries and whatnot. But the foreign entities, meaning the international bankers behind what's going on. And to me, it sounds exactly like the Gadianton robbers we are supposed to be concerned with. And it sounds like the same thing that President Benson was so emphatically against, and he was the what is the title? Something of agriculture. He saw a lot of this type of thing happening and wanted everyone to be aware of it. So let's keep going. The escape hatch to the insiders avoiding paying taxes was ready. It goes into a lot of details. You can read that. Just forgive me for saying like it happened and there is now that escape hatch. Can that just save us like 20 minutes from going into a lot of the details on this? And I'm sure I wouldn't get it totally correct anyway. Okay. So let's go to the Great War. The conspirators now had created the mechanisms to run up the debt, to collect the debt for themselves, and to avoid the taxes required to pay the yearly interest in debt. Now, all that was needed was a reason to escalate the debt. And it's interesting because, like, as soon as they start doing this, the debt runs up from like $1 billion to like $30 billion within no time, and then all the way to $455 billion within that 40 years or whatever. And now look at it. It's just increasing and increasing, exponential. And actually it is in running up that debt that the people who are trying to benefit from it, that's when they can really see their payday. So they needed a reason to escalate the debt. Nothing runs up the national debt quite like a war. And the World War I was already brewing in Europe. Now we have in 1916 Woodrow Wilson being reelected by a hair. He ran on the slogan to keep us out of the war. The American public was extremely opposed to America getting involved, but Wilson was stumping the country, giving his solemn word that American soldiers would not be sent into a foreign war, and he was preparing to do just the opposite. And in the last chapter, we had how he even for a decade before, he was kind of already in their pocket. And so, you're going to run on whatever is going to get you elected, right? And then you can always change the facts later. So 5 months later, after he was reelected on that platform, they were right in the war. The Jekyll Island conspirators were all deeply involved in getting us, and the stuff with Jekyll Island is so weird. That could be a big tangent on its own. You could look it up. The meetings, it sounds like maybe the meeting, like this Jekyll Island is the location for like some ancient, the ancient Anunnaki and giants and stuff, like weird stuff going on there. And it sounds like if that's ground zero for things happening anciently, it would be weird if it was also ground zero today for some very dark, terrible things happening. And like think of the name Jekyll Island. I gotta look up if they called it that before or they called it that after as like a nickname. But like that totally speaks to what's going on. So they were deeply involved in or invested in getting them involved. Many of these very financiers had loaned England large sums of money, and the conspiracy to get into a war had been going on for decades. So we have the assassination of Austrian Archduke was as merely just an inciting incident, which gave an excuse, which started a chain reaction. And so they were at war, and it was virtually a stalemate. And according to the author, it would have been shortly negotiated for a stalemate had not the U.S. declared war on Germany. And obviously the history books were that the Americans came in and they were the heroes and came in just in time when maybe it was, they were non-interventionists before and maybe they were close to a stalemate, but they needed a reason to get in. So let me read this. Actually, I might not even need to. It was a complete reversal of propaganda by the insiders behind things. Public opinion was controlled exclusively at this time by newspapers. Many of the major newspapers were controlled by the Federal Reserve crowd. There was the beating of the drums to get into the war. And now it was as if there was this new message going out that it was just inevitable that America was going to be a part of this war. So the propaganda on, there was propaganda on all sides. It was heavily one-sided, basically wherever you are. Germany was pictured as this militaristic monster which wanted to rule the world. This picture was painted by Britain, which had its soldiers in its countries around the world. They're painting the picture of Germany trying to rule the world while, the sun never sets on the British Empire, right? And they had places they had soldiers in more countries around the world than all other nations combined. And so, and that's not to kind of give an opinion on whether that was good or not, just stating the obvious that that was the case. So the so-called Prussian militarism did exist, but it was no threat to conquer the world, according to this author. At least in this World War I. The Germans were proving to be tough business competitors in the world markets, and the British didn't approve. So, In order to generate war fever, there was the sinking of a British ship called the Lusitania. And I actually was talking about this event a couple weeks ago with somebody when we were camping, and how that was the inciting incident that got the American public wanting to be a part of this war, or kind of turned the public opinion. Now, the what happened was there was this ship, and it had millions of 6 million rounds of ammunition, and it was sunk. It was sunk by the Germans, right? And so the British and the Germans were at war. They were getting supplies sent to them, and so the Germans, there shouldn't have been American passengers on board this ship anyway. That was actually illegal to be aboard a ship carrying munitions to belligerents. And so even in the German newspapers, they took out large ads in all New York newspapers warning potential passengers that the ship that was carrying munitions, and like it was already told that there was this ship going that was carrying munitions going over. And so that suddenly makes it a military kind of, it's like it's open game for stopping these munitions going over. And so, or open season, but the German government took out large ads warning potential passengers that the ship was carrying munitions and telling them not to cross the Atlantic on it. Those who chose to make the trip knew the risk that they were taking, and yet it was sunk. And this sinking was used by the clever propagandists to portray the Germans as inhuman slaughterers of innocents at this time. And it was actually on April 6th, 1917, that Congress declared war. During the war to end all wars, insider banker Bernard Baruch was made absolute dictator over American business when President Wilson appointed him chairman of the War Industries Board, where he had controlled all the domestic contracts for Allied war materials. And he made a lot of money from that. It was widely rumored that out of the war, he netted $200 million for himself. And so we're going to see that, just for the sake of not reading everything, and you can read it on your own, it's like we have these smaller investments into the war, into these revolutions, and then they come out with this major payday. So when you see this money going around, you have to wonder what's in it for, what's going on a little bit, and what's in it for the people who are doing that, and how are they going to benefit from that. We have this Barrack guy. We have Colonel House, was frontman to the International Banking Fraternity. He was like President Woodrow Wilson's, he was like his handler, like manipulated President Woodrow Wilson like a puppet. And gradually he, the House played a major role in creating the Federal Reserve System, passing the gradual income tax, and getting America into World War I. He was there during each of those major events that lead towards, just kind of lead this timeline along. And again, the real rulers are not always the ones that the public sees. So we have, again, we've mentioned Paul Warburg. He has a brother, Max Warburg. But Paul masterminded the establishment of the Federal Reserve to put control over the nation's economy into the hands of the international bankers. And as we know, international bankers and bankers in general, people in the know, according to this author, are able to create cycles of boom and bust, like the roller coaster economy. And if you traded any stocks ever, kind of it goes up and down, and if you were to know where it was going to go, even if you're doing these small micro stocks, even if you had a week, you could probably turn $1,000 into just the craziest amount of money if you knew every little uptick and downtick, because you can maximize you can benefit on both of those, right? You can benefit on both of those moments. All right. Sorry, where were we? Got a phone call. Let's see. Another name named Sir William Wiseman was amply awarded for his services. The Great War, World War I, was a financial bonanza for the international bankers, but it was a catastrophe of such magnitude for the United States that few even today grasp its importance, and it reversed our traditional foreign policy of non-involvement, or their national foreign policy, I guess I should say, because I am Canadian. So Winston Churchill once observed that all nations would have been better off had the U.S. minded its own business. Isn't that interesting? Had he done so, he said, quote, peace would have been made with Germany, and there would have been no collapse in Russia leading to communism, no breakdown of government in Italy followed by fascism, and Nazism would have never gained ascendancy in Germany. Oof. The Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was obviously one of the great turning points in world history. And there's just misinformation that abounds about that. There's the classic big lie again, that it was from like a movement from the downtrodden, but we kind of ignore what really happened. And so while almost everybody is reminded that the Bolshevik Revolution took place in November of 1917, few know that the Tsar had abdicated 7 months earlier in March. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit. We don't have to go into all the details about everything, but we have Tsar Nicholas, who had abdicated, or Tsar Nicholas II, and a provisional government was in place. And we have a government that gave way to the Kerensky regime. The Kerensky, a so-called democratic socialist, may have been running as a caretaker government for the communists. He kept the war going against Germany and the other Central Powers. He issued a general amnesty for the communists that had been exiled in the Red Revolution in 1905. And so back to Russia came 250,000 dedicated revolutionaries, and Kerensky's own government, their own government's doom was sealed. So the power has not come to the communist hands from the downtrodden masses necessarily, but that was a tool for, that was just, they were just the tools for people who were trying to make this actually happen. But the power had come from the top down in every instance. So I'm going to quote a couple things here. The year was 1917. The Allies were fighting the Central Powers. The Allies include, obviously, Russia, the British, France, United States later on in 1917. But in March of 1917, purposeful planners set in motion the forces to compel Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, and he did so under pressure from the Allies after severe riots in the Tsar's capital of Petrograd. There were other riots in other places, and it's interesting as we go, if you know anything about the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, you would think it was like this national takeover of so many places, and there were things happening in different cities, but it was largely happening in Petrograd. Almost seems like if something was to happen in Washington or any specific place, that it would be like the focal point of, and I guess that would make sense though. So where were Lenin and Trotsky at the time? Lenin was one of the people exiled. He was living in Switzerland, Western Europe, since 1905. He was exiled for trying to topple the Tsar in the abortive communist revolution of that year. Trotsky was in exile. Also, he was a communist. He was a reporter for a communist newspaper. The Bolsheviks were not a visible political force at the time that the Tsar was abdicated, but now it creates this kind of vacuum. And they came to power not because of the downtrodden masses of Russia's that called them back, but because very powerful men in Europe and the United States allegedly sent them in. So Lenin was sent across a Europe at war in the famous sealed train. And with him, he had $5 to $6 million in gold. The whole thing was arranged by the German High Command and Max Warburg. Remember, Paul Warburg was, we have Max on one side financing things, Paul on another side financing things, and now we have the German High Command financed by Max sending $5 to $6 million and Lenin to go topple this, to kind of raise themselves up in this power vacuum. Trotsky had left New York during the same time aboard the SS Christiana on March 27th, 1977, with his entourage of 275 revolutionaries. They arrived in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The Canadians grabbed Trotsky and his money and impounded them both. And in Canadian prison he was there for 5 days. Then all of a sudden, the British, through future, it doesn't matter. I don't want to go through all the names. But then all of a sudden, the British and the United States pressured the Canadian government. And despite the fact that we were now at war, meaning the Americans were now at war, said in not so many words, let Trotsky go. Thus, with an American passport, Trotsky went back to meet Lenin. And there they were able to hire thugs and make enough deals to impose out of the gun barrel what Lenin called all power to the Soviets. The communists came to power by seizing a handful of key cities. In fact, practically the whole Bolshevik Revolution took place in the one city, Petrograd. The Germans, on the face of it, had a plausible excuse for financing Lenin and Trotsky. The two Germans made most responsible for the financing of Lenin were Max Warburg and a displaced Russian named Alexander Helfand. Helphand. They could claim that they were serving their country's cause by helping and financing Lenin. However, these two German patriots neglected to mention, patriots with quotation marks, neglected to mention to the Kaiser their plan to foment a communist revolution in Russia. The brother of Max Warburg was Paul Warburg, and that's where this takes a new dimension. So the prime mover in establishing of the Federal Reserve, and who, from his position on the Federal Reserve Board of Directors, played a key role in financing the American war effort. And news leaked out in American newspapers about brother Max running the German finances, and that's when Paul resigned, without even without even a whimper. And that's when the plot even gets thicker, because the father-in-law of Max Warburg's brother, Felix, this is a big web. So we have Paul, Max, the father-in-law of Max's other brother, Felix, was Jacob Schiff, senior partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Paul and Felix Warburg, as you recall, were also partners in Kuhn and Loeb and Company. You might not have recalled that. While Max ran the Rothschilds Allied Family Bank in Frankfurt. I know, it's like a crazy web, but Jacob Schiff also helped finance Leon Trotsky, according to the New York Journal American of February 3rd, 1949. Quote, today it is estimated by Jacob's grandson, John Schiff, that the old man sank about $20 million at that early time for the final triumph of Bolshevism in Russia. The best sources of this is Tsarism and the Revolution by the important white Russian general named Arsene de Gulevich, where he says, quote, the main purveyors of funds for the revolution, however, were neither the crackpot Russian millionaires nor the armed bandits of Lenin. The real money primarily came from certain British and American circles, which for a long time past had lent their support to the Russian revolutionary cause. It was just like, whenever you can find this opportunity to topple and gain control of another government, it just seems like that is the game. He continues, quote, the important part played by the wealthy American banker Jacob Schiff in the events in Russia, though as yet only partially revealed, is no longer a secret. General Alexander Nechvolodov, Nechvolodov, is quoted by de Gulevich as stating that in his book on the Bolshevik Revolution, quote, in April 1917, Jacob Schiff publicly declared that it was thanks to his financial support that the revolution in Russia had succeeded. In spring of the same year, Schiff commenced to subsidize Trotsky, who was also being subsidized by Max Warburg and Olaf Aschberg. So Schiff spent millions to overthrow the Tsar and more millions to overthrow Kerensky. But Schiff raised he raised 10 million supposedly for the Jewish war relief in Russia, but later events revealed it to be a good business investment. Quote again from de Gulevich, quote, Mr. Bakhmetiev, Bakhmetiev, the late Russian imperial ambassador of the United States, tells us that the Bolsheviks, after victory, transferred 200 million rubles in gold between the years 1918 and 1922 to Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Schiff's firm. Quite the kickback for $10 million. 200 million rubles in gold. And that's the end of chapter 4. In the book, this is about 60% of the way. So we have 4 more chapters, but they are shorter. We have. I'll just give you a. Let me let you see this chart here that we're going to be going into, just so you can. Might be interesting to you. Let's move this here. So next chapter is called Financing the Bolshevik Revolution. Paul Warburg to the Colonel House to Trotsky, them financing Trotsky and Lenin. Jacob Schiff, EP Rockefellers. Max Warburg to Hitler, to Alfred Milner Rothschild, like J.P. Morgan. Man, this is going to be a short chapter, I think, as well, and I hope this is interesting to you. It's certainly interesting to me. I had known of a lot of these things, or I had heard of these things before, But it's interesting to hear names said and to see it explained in this book. So talk to you guys on the next one.